back in my early 20s. I was living in a small town about 30 miles outside of Portland, Oregon. It was a weird time in my life. I had just ended a 2-year relationship with my girlfriend, and I was kind of drifting, trying to figure out who I was and what I wanted. My grandma, who was deeply religious, had started going to church more often after my grandpa passed away. She was a pillar of strength in our family, and even though she was grieving, her faith never wavered. She'd always tell me that my grandpa was finally at peace with the Lord, and I could see how much that belief comforted her. I admired that about her. Her ability to find solace in something so intangible. It made me curious, so I started tagging along with her to Sunday services, partly to keep her company, and partly because I felt like I needed some kind of grounding in my own life. One Sunday after the service, I noticed a girl I'd never seen before. In a small, tight-knit community like ours, new faces stood out, especially at church. She was striking, long, wavy auburn hair and these piercing green eyes that seemed to see right through you. I waited until the service ended and introduced myself. There was something about her, a mix of curiosity and attraction, that pulled me in. Her name was Emma, and she had this quiet, mysterious vibe that made me want to know more about her. I tried asking her questions about where she was from and what brought her to town, but she deflected with jokes and playful teasing, saying I'd have to take her out if I wanted answers. I laughed and, honestly, I was into it. After some back and forth, she told me her family had recently moved to the area from California, and she was attending a community college nearby. That explained why I hadn't seen her around before. By the end of our conversation, I'd worked up the courage to ask for her number, and to my surprise, she gave it to me without hesitation. Over the next week, we texted constantly. I remember scrolling through her Instagram and noticing she didn't have many followers or posts. It was kind of refreshing. She wasn't one of those people who lived their life online. As we talked more, she started opening up about her family. Her stepdad was an alcoholic, and things at home weren't great. She didn't go into too much detail about her biological dad, but it was clear he was worse. She and her mom had moved to Oregon to get away from him. Hearing her story made me feel protective of her, but I didn't want to push too hard. I was just glad she trusted me enough to share. The following Sunday, I saw her at church again. I took it as a sign and asked her out on a proper date. She smiled and said yes without hesitation. We made plans to meet up later that week. When the night finally came, we kept it simple. Dinner at a local diner and a movie. It felt easy and natural, like we'd known each other for years. She was a great listener, and there was this genuine warmth about her that made me feel like I could be myself. After dinner, I suggested we take a drive to keep the conversation going. We headed out of town, driving along this quiet 2-lane highway that cut through the forest. It was peaceful, the kind of night where everything just feels right. But then, out of nowhere, everything changed. Emma started speaking, but it wasn't in English. Her words were fast and garbled, almost like she was speaking in tongues. At first, I thought she was joking or messing with me, but then I saw her eyes. They rolled back, leaving only the whites visible. I swerved, nearly hitting the guardrail, and pulled over to the shoulder. My heart was racing. I had no idea what was happening. She looked like she was in some kind of trance, her head vibrating slightly as she kept muttering in this strange language. I fumbled for my phone and called 911, barely able to explain what was going on. Just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Her eyes snapped back to normal, and she looked at me with this wild, terrified expression. Before I could say a word, she threw open the car door and bolted into the woods. I sat there, frozen, trying to process what had just happened. By the time the cops and paramedics arrived, she was gone. I told them everything, even though it sounded insane. They searched the area but found no trace of her. After that night, I never saw Emma again. Her Instagram was deleted, her phone number disconnected, and no one at church seemed to know who she was or where she'd come from. It was like she'd vanished into thin air. To this day, I have no idea what happened to her. That night messed me up in ways I still can't fully explain. I don't live in Oregon anymore, and every time I think about that town, I'm reminded of her and the mystery that still haunts me. My family has this beat-up 2012 Honda Accord that's practically held together by duct tape and prayers. I don't know how it's still running, but somehow it refuses to die. It's had a million problems: soft brakes, an engine that sputters like it's got a grudge, and half the electronics don't even work. My parents are basically waiting for it to kick the bucket so they can finally get a new car. But until then, guess who's stuck driving it? Yep, me. Oh, and did I mention the windshield wipers don't work? At all. Driving in the rain is basically a death wish. Even a light drizzle turns the windshield into a blurry mess. Normally, that wouldn't be a huge deal since I live in Arizona, where rain is about as common as a snowstorm in July. I remember my middle school teachers always making a big deal about how dry the state is, like it was some kind of badge of honor. But of course, the one time I really needed it to stay dry, the universe had other plans. This happened a couple of summers ago. I was driving back from a solo trip to visit my buddy Jake, who lives a few states over in Texas. Jake and I go way back, but we hadn't seen each other in years, so I decided to make the drive and turn it into a little adventure. I love road trips, and there's something peaceful about cruising through the empty stretches of desert. The drive to Texas was smooth sailing, windows down, music blasting, the whole vibe. I stayed at Jake's place for a few nights, and we spent most of the time catching up and honestly drinking way too much. It was a blast, and I was glad I made the effort to go. The drive back started off just as easy, but as soon as I crossed into Arizona, things took a turn. Out of nowhere, a massive storm rolled in, and I'm not talking about a little sprinkle. This was a full-on thunderstorm, complete with lightning and sheets of rain pouring down. I later found out it was one of the heaviest rainfalls the state had seen in decades. Go figure. Now, under normal circumstances, I'd just pull over and wait it out. But with my car's busted wipers, even a light rain would have been enough to force me to stop. So reluctantly, I pulled off the highway and parked a good distance into the desert, just in case some semi-truck didn't see me and decided to turn my car into a pancake. I figured I'd just wait it out, maybe try to catch some sleep. I thought about calling the cops for help, but money was tight, and I didn't want to risk getting a ticket for something stupid. And asking my 70-year-old parents to drive 4 hours to rescue me? Yeah, no. So, there I was, stuck on the side of the road, in the middle of a thunderstorm, in the desert, with not a single car passing by for over an hour. The storm didn't let up at all, and after a while, being alone out there started messing with my head. I don't know how to explain it, but after about an hour, I got this weird, uneasy feeling. Like I had this sudden urge to move the car. But with the rain still coming down in buckets, that wasn't an option. I found myself nervously glancing out the windows, like I was expecting to see something out there. Of course, there was nothing, just miles and miles of empty desert. But as the sun started to set, casting this eerie twilight over everything, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I'm not usually the type to scare easily, but I've heard enough creepy desert stories to know better than to ignore my gut. Just as I was starting to really freak myself out, the rain finally began to let up a little. I figured I'd be able to get back on the road soon, which was a huge relief. But then, out of nowhere, I saw these flashes of light in the distance. At first I thought it was just lightning, but these were different. Sharp, white bursts that seemed to dart around like they were coming from multiple directions. My heart started racing as I realized the lights were getting closer. I don't know what came over me, but instinct took over. I grabbed my phone, scrambled out of the car, and ran to hide behind a nearby rock formation. It was still raining, but I didn't care. I crouched low, peeking around the edge of the rock, and watched as 3 figures approached my car. They were waving flashlights around like they were on something, dancing, stumbling, I don't even know. It was weird, like something out of a horror movie. They circled my car, shining their lights inside like they were looking for something, or someone. I held my breath, trying to stay as still as possible. Then, out of nowhere, one of them fired a gunshot into the air. I nearly jumped out of my skin, biting down on my lips so hard I drew blood. Every instinct told me to stay hidden, to make myself invisible. I don't know how long I stayed there, frozen in place, but eventually, I worked up the courage to peek around the rock again. The flashlights were gone, and for a moment, I thought maybe they'd left. But then, just like that, the lights were back, flickering around my car like they were taunting me. I knew I couldn't stay there all night, so I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, whispering into the phone as I tried to explain what was happening. The operator said they'd send someone, and I hung up, feeling both relieved and terrified. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw the faint glow of police lights in the distance. The second the lights started flashing, the three figures turned and bolted into the darkness. By the time the cop pulled up next to my car, they were long gone. I ran through the rain, waving my arms, just grateful to be alive. The officer listened as I told him everything, and while he didn't seem all that surprised, it somehow made the whole thing feel even creepier. He waited out the storm with me and didn't tow my car, which I guess was a small win. I still think about that night all the time. And yeah, I haven't done a road trip since. What I'm about to tell you is the strangest experience I've ever lived through. My name is Emily, and my friend Jessica and I were driving from Texas to Ohio a few months ago. We were coming back from visiting some friends who had moved down to Austin for work. It was a great trip, but Jessica and I had to get back to reality. The drive was supposed to be fun, just the two of us, a bunch of snacks, some good music, and plenty of time to catch up on everything we hadn't talked about in forever. Looking back, it probably would have been smarter to stay one more night at our friend's place, but I was eager to get home. We planned to do the whole drive in one shot. We drove through the night and into the next morning. A few hours after sunrise, my back started to ache from sitting in the same position for so long. I told Jessica we should pull over somewhere to take a break, grab some gas, and maybe find something to eat before hitting the road again. We passed a few exits before finally getting off at what was advertised as a charming little tourist town. For the life of me, I can't remember the name of the town. It was one of those places you'd expect to be a cute pit stop, with signs pointing to local attractions, unique shops, and promises of historic charm. But as soon as we pulled in, I felt something was off. The streets were empty, and the buildings looked like they'd seen better days. Way too run down for a place that was supposed to cater to tourists. It's hard to explain, but it was one of those towns where you could just feel something was wrong, even if you couldn't put your finger on it. You know that feeling when you drive through one of those ghost towns where all the shop signs are still up, but everything's clearly abandoned? Yeah, that's what it felt like, except it was weirder because things weren't abandoned. They just looked like they should have been. It wasn't your typical haunted vibe, but it was strange enough that it stuck with me ever since. Our first stop was a convenience store. We had to drive a bit before reaching what I guess you'd call the heart of the town. We pulled into the parking lot and grabbed some snacks. Inside, everything seemed pretty normal. Jessica was looking for a specific energy drink she likes, but she got frustrated when they didn't have it. She's a bit of a drama queen, so I humored her and agreed to try another store. I still wanted to grab my iced tea though, so I walked up to the counter to pay. The cashier was a woman in her late 20s, maybe early 30s. She had dark hair and was on the taller side. The only reason I remember her so clearly is because she was wearing a bright red apron, which stood out to me. I paid for my drink and we left. Jessica pointed to another convenience store across the street, so we decided to check it out. When we walked into the second store, my stomach dropped. The cashier behind the counter looked exactly like the woman who'd been working at the first store. Same hair, same face, same height, same everything. I froze, staring at her. I could tell I was making her uncomfortable. Finally, I asked if she had a twin or a sister working at the other store. She gave me this weird, skeptical look and said she didn't have any siblings. She even narrowed her eyes and told me it was a strange question, which, okay, fair. I tried to explain myself, but she didn't say anything else. I felt this weird sense of déjà vu and backed out of the store, dragging Jessica with me. Jessica was confused, but I explained what I'd seen and asked if she'd noticed the same thing. She said she didn't remember what the other cashier looked like, and that I was probably just tired from driving so long. I knew what I'd seen though, and I told her I'd prove it. We ran back to the first convenience store, but when we got there, the woman inside looked nothing like the person I remembered. She was short, with blonde hair, and looked to be in her 50s. There was no way anyone could have confused her for the other cashier. It was like I'd imagined the whole thing. Jessica told me to just forget about it, and that I was tired, but I insisted I wasn't making it up. Eventually, I had to let it go. We needed gas, so we pulled into the first station we saw. The place was completely empty. Just our car, the pumps, and a small building where you'd pay. We were the only ones there. Jessica took her time looking for her energy drink, but of course, they didn't have it. I paid, waited for her, and we left. We couldn't have been inside for more than a minute, but as we walked out, I felt that weird gut feeling again. What had been an empty gas station just seconds ago was now packed. Cars filled every pump, and there was even a line. The parking lot was full too. To make it worse, it felt like everyone was staring at us as we walked to our car. I've never felt more uncomfortable in my life. This time, Jessica agreed something was off. It was like we'd stepped out of reality for a second, and when we came back, everything had shifted. We decided to skip the food and just get back on the highway. I didn't have much of an appetite by that point anyway. Back on the road, we didn't talk much for a while. I wasn't scared exactly, but I had this awful feeling in my gut. I can't even explain it. As we drove further, Jessica and I started talking about how weird everything had been. Just as we were starting to relax, a car passed us, a gray Honda Odyssey with a huge crack in the windshield. I remember it clearly because the crack looked like a spider web, and the side of the van was all scratched up. Jessica made a joke about it, but I can't remember what she said. About 10 minutes later, the exact same van passed us again. We were both 100% sure it was the same one. How was that even possible? We'd been driving straight at a steady speed. There's no way it could have gotten ahead of us. Jessica started saying, "Oh my God," over and over, and I could tell she was on the verge of a panic attack. She told me to speed up, so I did. I was freaking out inside, but I had to keep it together for her sake. I just wanted to get back on the highway and leave that place behind forever. I glanced down at the GPS and saw that an hour had somehow passed since we'd left the gas station, which made no sense. I wanted to tell Jessica, but I didn't think she could handle any more weirdness. My heart was pounding, but I kept driving. Part of me wondered if the GPS was going to start leading us in circles. Finally, we made it back to the highway, and the nightmare seemed to end there. By the time we got home, it felt like we were waking up from some bizarre, disjointed dream. Even now, when I think back to that day, it feels like a dream. People usually look at me like I'm crazy when I tell this story. I've tried researching weird occurrences in places like that, and I've actually found a few stories that are similar to mine. The strangest part was that gut feeling, like every bone in my body was screaming that something was wrong. I'd never felt anything like it before, and I hope I never do again.